My name is Brandon. I'm 27 years old and my partner, Melissa, is 26. My father, Eric, is 52, and my mother, Kathy, is 50. Like many who've been through this, I never thought it would happen to me. But here we are. From listening to other stories, it seems you all like a backstory, so I'll try to be as clear and precise as possible. Melissa and I met during her freshman year of college. We both lived in the same dorm building, and eventually, we crossed paths. We later found out that we lived just 2 towns away from each other, so whenever we went home, I would let her ride with me. It only added about 20 minutes to my drive, so it was no big deal. After multiple trips and hanging out at school, we started dating. I have a close-knit family and so does she. We told our families right away. I had met her several times while dropping her off, but it was usually just introductions and exchanging pleasantries. Both of our families accepted each other with open arms, and our relationship grew. I was a year ahead of her, so when I graduated, I returned home, where I was offered a good job with great pay. I visited her at school whenever possible, and whenever she came home, we made time for each other. After she graduated, she moved in with me since our jobs were in the city near where we grew up. Like me, she was offered a well-paying position at her current company. After living together for about 3 years, I proposed, and we've been planning our wedding since. Now, on to the part you're all listening to. Looking back, I overlooked plenty of things, thinking my father was just trying to welcome Melissa into the family. Things like my father calling her all the time, and if I was around, they'd say they were discussing the upcoming family party or something along those lines. Once Melissa was in the shower and her phone rang. I saw that it was my dad, so I answered. He sounded upset and surprised when he realized it was me. When I asked what was up, he said he wanted to talk to Melissa about my mother's birthday, which was coming up in a week. After a brief conversation, we ended the call. Even typing this out now, I feel like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. On the day I found out, it started like any other day. Melissa had Thursdays off, so she made breakfast for both of us. When I set out for work, she gave me a kiss and told me to have a great day. During my drive to work, I realized I'd forgotten some paperwork I needed for a meeting at 3 p.m. I shrugged it off and planned to go home at lunch to retrieve it. Melissa texted me throughout the day about casual things like what to have for dinner and whether I wanted her to hang up my laundry. I didn't see a need to tell her I was coming home for lunch, so when the time came, I just left work and headed home. When I arrived home, I noticed a car resembling my father's in the parking lot, but I didn't think much of it and parked. I walked into our building, and upon opening the door, I was met with a scene straight out of a movie. A cliched moment where a man comes home early and catches his spouse cheating. There was a trail of clothes, both his and hers, leading to my bedroom, and faint moans echoed throughout the apartment. I stood frozen at the door in utter shock, a mix of rage, sadness, and disgust brewing inside me. If you were a fly on the wall, you'd have seen a statue. I just couldn't move. Eventually, I snapped out of it and took out my phone to record. I gathered all the clothes on the floor and threw them into the building's hallway before filming my walk to the bedroom. The door was open. I stood in the doorway, filming for about a minute before flipping on the lights. They both jumped at the sudden brightness and looked at me, and to my utter shock, it was my father in bed with Melissa. After the initial stun, my father noticed I was recording and started panicking, trying to find anything to cover himself and urging me to stop filming. He wrapped a towel around himself and approached me. I told him, "If you don't want to get hurt, stop coming near me." He either didn't care or didn't hear me and reached for my phone. I hit him square in the jaw, and his head bounced off the door before he slumped to the ground. Melissa shrieked, and I aimed the camera at her. "Worried about your F***K, buddy, but nothing to say to your partner." My father woke up after about a minute, and I told them, "I just needed to come pick something up for work, so I'm heading back now. If either of you pieces of S***T are here when I return, I'll send this video to everyone you know." I ended the video, looked at my dad, who was still coming to, and said, "You're dead to me. You're no longer my father, but you might want to go home and talk to Mom because I'll be talking to her very soon." I sat in my car for a while until one of my bosses at work called to ask where I was. I told her I was on my way back. When I handed her the paperwork in her office, I must have looked terrible because she immediately asked what was wrong. I told her it was nothing and that I'd be okay. She scanned me up and down, noticed blood on my collar, stood up and said, "You're bleeding." I looked down and replied, "It's my father's." She was confused, so I pulled out my phone and showed her the video. She watched the whole thing. She had met Melissa a few times, but never my father. She sat silent for a moment until she realized my partner was not only cheating on me, but was also doing it with my father. She asked if there was anything she could do and suggested I take some time off. I told her, "I can't go back there right now. I just need a minute and I'll be fine for the meeting. I have another shirt in my office." The meeting went fine. I put on a smile for everyone like nothing had happened. Afterward, my boss came up to me and asked how I managed to get through it. I just said, "I don't know," and went to my office. Then I came home and found myself alone for the first time in a long while. I definitely need to get out of this apartment because I can't live here anymore, and there's no way I'm sleeping in that bed. I know I have to get checked for STDs, and I think I broke something in my hand. The day after, I tried to contact my mother, but none of my calls connected. I wanted to see if she would get lunch with me so I could tell her everything. After about a dozen attempts, I decided to drive to my mother's house. She needed to know what happened as soon as possible, even if talking about it was going to make the pain resurface. During the drive, I thought about what I would say and how I'd say it, and it made me start to panic. I had to pull over twice to throw up. It's not every day that you have to tell your mom that her husband is sleeping with your partner. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a moment to calm down and gather my thoughts. I was still in the car when my mother threw her front door open. I stepped out and she began cursing at me, saying, "How dare you come to my house after hitting your father when he tried to break up a fight between you and Melissa?" She called me every name in the book and labeled me an abuser, telling me to leave because Melissa wasn't ready to forgive me yet. If she were smart, she never would. Apparently, my father took Melissa to my family's home and told my mom that Melissa and I had argued, and he intervened to stop the fight. But I hit him. She kept going until I snapped and said, "Really, Mom? Your husband is F*** king, my partner. That's why I hit him. If you don't believe me, I'll send you a video. But don't expect to see me again because you just treated me like trash. Don't come begging for an apology when you realize you're just as bad a parent as my worthless father." Her face dropped. She looked just like I did when I first walked into my apartment and caught them. I pulled out my phone and sent her the video. She watched up to the part where I turned on the light, then put her phone down. She looked up at me, but I turned and got into my car. I backed out of her driveway, glanced at her before driving away, and saw her in tears. My heart went out to her, but she'd said too much for me to turn back and forgive her. When I got home, I started clearing everything out of my apartment that reminded me of Melissa or my family. I boxed up all of Melissa's things and put them next to the front door. Legally, this has been her residence, so I can't technically evict her. Her name isn't on the lease, and she tends to shy away from conflict. If she returns for anything other than picking up her things, there will definitely be plenty of conflict. Anything related to my parents went into storage. As I mentioned before, we were a very close family, but I've never had a problem cutting toxic people out of my life. I texted Melissa's parents to let them know I was calling off the engagement and that she'd been cheating on me. I thanked them for all they'd done for me. Our relationship was still growing, but they were always kind and supportive, which made this betrayal even more painful. I asked if they could come and pick up all her belongings. I haven't heard back from them yet, but I'm hoping they can take her things so Melissa doesn't have a reason to return. I wish I could say I'm doing great, but that would be a lie. My emotions come in waves. Sometimes I'm numb, and other times I'm boiling with rage. I haven't had a happy moment since I found out. Other than a few friends, I don't have anyone in real life, especially now that my family turned out to be S***T. I decided to start taking care of everything that needed to be done, like getting tested, finding a therapist, moving, and of course, buying a new bed. I began by calling my doctor's office, telling them I needed to get tested and asking for a therapist referral. My first therapy session was 2 weeks ago, and we decided to continue meeting once a week. I got tested last week, but it'll be another week or so before I get the results. Cross your fingers for me. I reached out to a real estate agent friend, and he sent me a bunch of listings. I chose a refurbished cabin on the outskirts of my city, and I finished moving 2 days ago. After moving, I called Melissa's parents again. I told them I'd moved out and that Melissa still hadn't picked up her things. I also mentioned that the landlord would start showing the apartment in a few days, so someone needed to collect her stuff before it was thrown out. That must have lit a fire under them, because the next day, my former landlord texted me to thank me for getting the apartment emptied. No one knows where I live now, except the friend who helped me find this place, so I know neither Melissa nor my parents will be dropping by. The only downside is that I traded a 10-minute walk to work for a 45-minute drive. My phone has been blowing up with texts and calls from Melissa, my parents, and some of my friends, but I have no interest in talking to anyone other than my therapist. At work, I've been a ghost. I go in, do my job, and leave. On the rare occasions that I have to talk to someone, I put on a fake smile and pretend everything is fine. My boss has been checking in on me more often, but I don't share much with her. I just say that I appreciate it and that I'll be okay. The truth is, I don't know if I'll be okay. I get that time heals, but it feels like that's only relevant when you're dealing with a single issue, not when you lose the 3 closest people in your life all at once. A huge part of me died, and there's no bringing it back. My therapy sessions are going well, I suppose. I've never done therapy before, so I don't have a reference for what good therapy looks like. We get along well, and she genuinely seems to want to help. Our first session was mostly about getting to know each other and providing an overview of what brought me there. The second session went deeper. She asked me about my relationship with my parents, and I told her it was great until recently. We often talked and communicated well when something was wrong, and I grew up in a wonderful home. But now, none of that matters. She asked why I'd cut my mother out of my life, and I explained that my mother said things to me that I wouldn't say to someone I despised. I also told her there was no coming back from that. At the end of our last session, I shared the link to my YouTube channel so she could hear more about how I feel and what's going on in my head. So, if you're listening to this, hi doc. For now, I'm still miserable. I thought I'd be okay by now, not necessarily happy, but okay. I know part of it is my own fault for not reaching out to my friends, but even thinking about responding to them feels exhausting. I know they'll want to get together or visit my new place, but I just don't have the energy for socializing. Until I do, I'll work, attend my appointments, and sit on my back deck sipping bottom-shelf whiskey while trying to enjoy this beautiful view. I haven't hunted since high school, so maybe I'll take that up again, now that I can hunt from my porch. I mentioned things like getting tested for STDs and restarting my life. I'm happy to report that I'm clean, which is a huge relief. I'm now fully settled into my new place. When I mentioned that my new home was a refurbished cabin, I might have been a little generous. It was refurbished almost 25, 30 years ago, so it was a bit dated. With all my newfound free time, I decided to renovate it myself. All that's left to do is paint the guest room, which I've turned into an office. The only things I didn't do myself were the electrical and plumbing work, because I have no interest in getting shocked or handling sewage-covered pipes. Renovating the cabin was incredibly stress-relieving and helped clear my head. I still see my therapist once a week. It probably saved my life. Being able to vent, express my frustrations, and receive the advice I need has been invaluable. I'm still working at the same company, and I've become more open with some of my closer coworkers and my boss, thanks to my therapist's advice. Also, with her encouragement and your suggestions, I've started reaching out to my friends and have slowly begun reintegrating into the group. Now, on to the update about my family and my ex. I decided I was ready to talk to my mother, so a little over a month ago, I unblocked her number and reached out. I called, and she picked up almost instantly. I could tell from her voice that she was panicking. Once I reassured her that it was me, I suggested that we meet up, and she agreed. We met at a diner near her house the next day. She was there before I arrived and started quietly sobbing when she saw me. After I sat down, she repeatedly apologized, saying that she could only believe what she was told, because she never imagined my father and Melissa would be together. I told her I appreciated her apology, but that what she said to me was despicable. Things no mother should ever say to her child. It showed me what she truly thought of me. She cried even harder and promised it wasn't true. She explained that she was furious when she heard I'd hit my father, and when I showed up at the house, she let her anger take over. Not wanting to argue further, I moved on and asked what she was doing about my father. She told me she'd separated from him the day after I sent her the video and had immediately contacted a lawyer. As for my ex, my mom said that after I left, She returned to the house and threw them both out because she couldn't bear to look at them. We talked for about an hour in total, and before I left, I told her that because of what she said, I didn't have my mother when I needed her most. For that reason, I didn't know if I could have her in my life. However, I was willing to work on our relationship, but at my own pace. She stopped me before I could leave and said she had something important to tell me. I sat back down, and she revealed that Melissa is pregnant. Melissa had shown up at the house to tell my mom. She wasn't sure whether the baby was mine or my father's and asked my mom if I'd been in touch so she could let me know. My mom hadn't heard from me, so she just sent Melissa away. After hearing the bombshell from my mother, I was stunned into silence. Melissa was pregnant. I couldn't bear to imagine what I would do if the baby was mine. I left the diner without another word, unable to process what I'd just heard. My mother called after me, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. Instead, I got into my car and drove aimlessly, eventually finding my way back to the cabin, my temporary refuge. The following days passed in a haze of confusion and anxiety. I couldn't bring myself to answer my phone or check my messages, not wanting to face the deluge of emotions waiting for me. My therapist urged me to confront my feelings head-on, but the most I could manage was writing about them in my journal. I stayed disconnected from my closest friends, not sharing the pregnancy news with anyone. The burden of shame weighed heavily on my shoulders, leaving me hollow. I moved through my days on autopilot, going to work, doing the bare minimum, and leaving without speaking to anyone. My boss tried to check in on me, but I waved her off, giving her a weak, "I'm fine," before walking away. A week later, my mother left me a voicemail. Her voice was filled with desperation, urging me to speak with Melissa to learn the truth about the pregnancy. My therapist suggested reaching out to Melissa's parents, who could help facilitate a conversation without emotions boiling over. Hesitantly, I messaged them, explaining my concerns and asking for their help in setting up a meeting with Melissa. They responded quickly, offering their support. When I finally met with Melissa, she looked gaunt and distraught, her eyes swollen and bloodshot from crying. She could barely look me in the eye. "I'm so sorry, Brandon," she muttered. "I know I've done the worst thing possible, but I don't know whose baby this is." Her words cut deeply, but I remained calm. "Melissa, I don't want to fight you, I just need the truth," I said. She nodded, and her parents arranged for a paternity test as soon as possible. In the following days, my thoughts raced with fear and uncertainty. The idea that the child could be mine filled me with dread, but the alternative was equally disturbing. I worried about what kind of life the child would have if my father were the father. The results finally came back, confirming my worst fears. The child wasn't mine, but my father's. Melissa broke down, crying uncontrollably as the realization of her betrayal sank in. I left without another word, refusing to maintain contact with her. Although rebuilding my life from this devastation seemed overwhelming, my therapist guided me through the storm. My mother was heartbroken but moved ahead with the divorce. She didn't want anything to do with Melissa or the child, and she cut my father out of her life entirely. He tried to convince her otherwise, but she remained resolute. Melissa became estranged from both families, left to raise the child on her own. Meanwhile, I focused on finding solace and rebuilding my life. The cabin became my sanctuary as I started to make it feel like home again. Slowly, I began reaching out to friends and speaking with my therapist about my fears and grief, coming to terms with this upheaval. I knew I'd never be able to undo the betrayal, but I also knew that I had to move forward. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how I responded. Though the scars would remain, I was determined to find peace and embrace the new beginnings awaiting me. I have a lot on my mind, and I'm not sure what to do or feel. Some days, I wake up and feel like I can take on the world. Other days, I struggle to get out of bed. It's a roller coaster of emotions, but I guess that's normal, considering everything I've been through. Despite all this, I wanted to share my story and hopefully get some advice. To those who think it's fake, I wish I was this creative. I'd write books instead of working a 9-to-5 job. Thank you for listening, and sorry for rambling on and on. I've learned that life goes on no matter how devastating the circumstances, and while it may seem like the end of the world at the moment, time does help heal, even if just a little. I'm focusing on myself now, trying to rediscover who I am outside of all this chaos. I know it's going to be a long journey, but I'm ready to face it one step at a time. Thank you for being there and for your support.